I thought I'd go in a little calmer this time. I think I was a bit overhyped last time we went into Radio DJ's feel. We are back once again. I'm going to desperately resist to say with the Renegade Master. I'm not the Renegade Master, but we're here for another Man Baggage, Man Chat. And I am joined by a few people today. Hello, Jordan. But we are joined by Josh, a slight change of the schedule, Stu, and Chris. And we're going to be delving into a few concepts around masculinity, the patriarchy. We're going to talk about how this stuff benefits men, but also I think oppresses men as well. And just whilst I let others in, Jordan, if you're watching this, I'm going to hold you to join in one of these, please. So, bikes. Yeah. That's very niche. No one is going to have a clue what bikes is. But yeah. There. And Josh. Sorry, this looks like one of those dinosaur parents. Sorry, folks, if you're a bit of an older generation. Slowly letting people in. Oh, look at that. Seamless. It works.
Fantastic.
I've got to go through that awkward, like, bless her, staring at my mum using a phone, like,
there we are.
Everyone's painfully watching. How are you all?
Very well, sir. How are you?
All right. Why do you all look so nervous?
We got the hat memo. You didn't, Dan.
That's why. I mean, look, I should be the nervous one. Jeez.
I daren't.
Have you got a cousin Italian plumber that's looking for you?
I've had that one. I've had Macho Libre.
Nice.
What else have I had? Well, I've had paedophile as well, which I'm not a fan of. To be
I think that's just the default setting. If you grow a womb broom, then you've unfortunately got to take the paedophile term as a.
But I can live with it for a month at least. At least. Thanks for joining us. I noticed you giving up your precious, valuable time. I think like the thing that I really wanted out of this is, I say what thing I really wanted. It's not really with an agenda. I think like male health and mental health and being an advocate for all of those things, and possibly dealt with a few things over my own lifespan, is just bringing these conversations to the forefront of everyone's minds, but more from I feel like we do a lot about speaking, like let's raise awareness, but what does awareness do? Let's see this stuff in action, and let's see people talking about things that are important to the male demographic, which maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking about publicly all the time.
Yeah. I think that's one thing I wanted to check though is, does any of us have any diagnosed mental illnesses?
I mean, I have, yeah. I do.
So for me, I historically struggled with depression, or what I thought was depression, but actually through sort of some therapeutic work, it looks like it's a secondary issue, and anxiety is probably the main driving force. That's not been sort of the depression was certainly looked at through the GP and stuff, but anxiety was never really talked about.
I mean, Josh, you've got it in hard there, mate. You haven't even bought me a drink yet.
That's great. Do you know what it is? I think there's this thing as well where I just would like to have disclaimers when people talk about mental health, mental illness, like you just said there about raising awareness. And it's like, I always like to check in with our privileges just in case, we are 4 white men who are talking about, mental illness, mental health, all these things. And then maybe we don't, well, I know I don't suffer with mental illnesses. I've had bouts of, like you say, depressive moods, but not clinical depression, not anything diagnosed of that sort. And so I always like to just check in with privilege, just because it's not that we can't talk about these conversations, but I think it's also, like you say, a lot of people jump on the bandwagon of talking about mental health without actually experiencing, because I've got a lot of mental illnesses through my family, and so through that, I know it's just very different, like the conversations between it. So I didn't mean to go in with no lube and straight in there, but
well, you have done anyway.
I have done anyway.
On a serious note, I think that's like a really valid point, because I think when people talk about mental health, they use mental health and mental illness interchangeably, when, especially in the fitness community, we like to stick to like happy, clappy mental health and what people do to maintain their own equilibrium of that. And, that's very individual. But in terms of mental illness and episodes of mania and the quality of life that some experience, how debilitating that can be to the point somebody can't leave the house, or how that affects interpersonal relationships, how that affects their jobs and their working relationships and their personal relationships. That's a totally different beast. And I feel like we do tiptoe around that quite a lot because it's bloody uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree very much with Josh on that one. And, you know, this acceptance of these are different. I know this is what you talk about a lot, Dan, trying to separate these two out. And in the same vein as I've had those experiences in the family. So whilst that may not have directly been me, you feel the impact of those enormously. Obviously, we see the impact that does have on childhood, things like schizophrenia and bipolar that do have a huge impact on how parents show up for the children. And that's obviously not their fault by any means, but it can have a big knock-on effect onto how we perceive and experience the world as well. So just that acknowledgement of that privilege and the fact that there does need to be some nuance here, I think that's a huge point for sure.
Yeah. I think as well, what really changed my perspective of mental health was, as you both are reflecting on, is actually experiencing it firsthand. So I would say lucky enough to have, you know, an upbringing where I didn't have any sort of family members or anyone directly in contact with me who did, you know, certainly outwardly struggle with their mental health. So as I was growing up, I didn't realise mental health was really a thing, and it took that experience of me beginning to struggle with my mental health for me to really understand that actually mental health isn't just this airy-fairy term that, you know, people use as an excuse when they're feeling a bit sad or a bit angry or whatever. It's a real thing that can manifest itself in a lot of problematic ways. So I now see that period of my life as a really positive thing. At the time, you know, it was horrible, but it's really given me an insight into mental health issues and challenges that I simply wouldn't have had if it wasn't for that.
I think generationally as well, it's rightfully so. There's probably more spoken about, people are more vocal about it these days, whereas perhaps I can think back to childhood and probably, I know we say mental illness doesn't look a certain way, but certainly interactions with people and think that person was mentally poorly at that time, perhaps, but because we weren't having these candid conversations about mental health, it probably wasn't classed as anything. And then to your initial question, and I said yes to immediately, Josh, is that I don't live defined by a label, but I quite comfortably say that is something I've experienced or I am experiencing at that time. And I think with men and conversation, something I'm just hugely aware of myself is when it comes to my sense of self and my sense of identity, I think there's an air of caution when we too closely align and define ourselves by anything. You know, again, in fitness, we see it with bodybuilders, we see it with CrossFitters, is when you are one thing, you know, I'm never going to put that in my bio, for example, because it's part of me, but I don't want it to define me. It's a human experience. And again, with what we was mentioning with interchangeably used terms, I think a lot of terms around mental illness are quite flippantly used.
Oh, yeah.
We pathologise a lot, which a lot of the time is just human experience. You know, you can experience angst and not have anxiety disorder. You can feel sad and not be clinically depressed. You can be particular about things but not be OCD, because the impact to the people that are experiencing those are huge, you know. And I do know people that have suffered with obsessive compulsive disorder, and you know, it ruins their life. It's not a case of I like my books all neat on the shelf.
Exactly. That's something which frustrates me massively. You go on TikTok and it's basically top trumps for mental health. You know, you scroll for a minute and then you've got ADHD, you've got OCD, you're depressed, you've got anxiety. And again, there was a recent study which was looking at the pathology and like the accuracy of TikTok information around mental health, and I think it was over like 60, nearly 70% of the information delivered on TikTok was wrong. You know, when you're talking about ADHD, and so it's really easy to label ourselves as like, I've got ADHD because, you know, I'm just so distracted in this distracting world, or I've got anxiety because I just feel stressed in social situations. It's really just pathologizing normal behaviors, which is dangerous, because the thing is, when we start to kind of casualize a lot of these terminologies, then we take away the true meaning of the people that suffer with them like greatly, right? So like there's a difference between depression and feeling depressed. Like you said there, it's like important to make those distinctions because, you know, if you go through a period of grief, if you go through a period of, you know, whatever, a depressive state, you know, that is a feeling of sadness. It's a feeling of, but there will be, the clouds will clear and, you know, that will hopefully come out of it. Whereas being clinically depressed, you know, there's a freaking imbalance of your, you know, brain chemistry, and that's going to be something which is a lot more of a struggle. And so, yeah, I think, again, that's why I always like to go into that initial question, just simply because I think a lot of people, like you say, especially in the fitness space, can use mental health in a very like fluffed term and in a way that doesn't necessarily fully create the nuance and context of just the overarching theme of mental illness and mental health and all of it encumbered. But as men, it's even harder. Well, not even harder, but it's tough for us to vocalize that, right? Because again, societal norms, us trying to put up this front of being strong and that we are always in control. And so I think, you know, that's always the interesting conversation around men's mental health is even if you are struggling just with mental health poorly or you are suffering with a mental illness, the stigma and stereotypes of you being able to vocalize that is the same. And it's tough. It can be really fucking tough, as we see with the, you know, horrifying numbers of male suicide. So, yeah. Sorry, I went straight into the deep conversations here.
That's what we're here for.
So I was just going to add there, when you're talking about labels and that sort of thing, I certainly, when it was sort of early 20s that I was really beginning to struggle with my mental health. And I would have labelled what I was going through as a mental health illness. But I now look back at that time and I don't see it that way. I look at it and through that experience, when I consider how I moved from that point to a much healthier point, there were certain factors that changed, and a lot of it was to do with my lifestyle. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for everyone. Certainly, in my instance, for me in that situation, there were a lot of changes socially in particular, where I simply became a lot less isolated. And in terms of upping exercise and eating better, which certainly contributed towards moving me from that point to a much healthier one. So when I look back at it now, I don't necessarily see it as an illness. I actually think of it as the anxiety that I struggled with in particular as a protective response. So my brain seeing it as like, this is danger, so what I'm trying to do is protect you. I'm amping up this anxiety to prevent you from danger. And depression, the depression that I felt as a secondary issue, again, you could argue that that's actually a protective response to keep me away from danger. So that's why a really good example, I think, of why I think it's not always helpful to do that sort of labeling of yourself as, you know, my depression or my anxiety or my mental health illness. So yeah, it's a really good point for sure.
Yeah, totally. Something that really jumped out at me then is that quite often, and this is what I experienced in many of these conversations with men and people around their mental health, is that these things we've got are there we need to rid ourselves of those things. But actually, when you're talking about cultivating a sense of self-compassion and not being hard on yourself, none of that grind harder bollocks, but it's actually like these, I'm not defective, I'm not broken, these parts are there for a certain purpose at that time. And a lot of the time, that's to create something. You know, we work in the fitness industry, we see it with people with control measures around their exercise, meticulously tracking every morsel of food. Is a lot of these things are there because they serve a purpose in some shape or form, whether it's avoidance, it's disassociation, it is your brain creating safety at that time.
I think that's so important for this reduction of shame around these things. Because when you realise that they're functional and they serve a purpose, and I suppose this is maybe why I personally resonate really well with IFS, like internal family systems, just because you can see how these are serving that role. And so all of a sudden they make a little bit more sense. And whilst we're massively illogical creatures, but things do make sense in the context that they are in. And I know for me and my own, looking back in the same way, we can sort of make things make sense in hindsight, and obviously we need to be aware of that and not attach stories to things that may not be the case, with that not necessarily being an accurate representation of the reality at the time, when it's filtered through like our emotional experience and our various states. But for me, that functionality element of, oh, this is actually doing something to protect the whole, the self, the version of me in the middle, just helps reduce or take the edge off that shame. And that in itself can be that little nice transformative step to being able to make further change from there.
Yeah, when you realise it's part of you and it serves a purpose, is, I think, when we often talk about self-compassion and compassion in general, it's thought of as airy-fairy. It just allows you to almost have that thought interruption. Can I be objective about this? Because, you know, a lot of the things that I'm aware of that trigger me have triggered me in the past. And I mean that in the most strictest sense. I don't mean that as in triggering, oh, someone said something I mildly disagree.
You're not gonna dye your hair and just go fucking crazy when you
But as it, like, to the point in that does bring up things for me, probably from like being a child and stuff like that, is not that stuff's never going to affect me again. And this is again with the self-compassion thing, it's just I'm more aware of where that comes from, and I'm consciously aware of putting that pause in there. So I just turn the volume down on it and actually not let that ruin my day, or not let that evoke the reaction it normally would. So then you can be more responsive and not reactive to things. Because I think so many of us live an existence of just reaction based all of the time. You know, can you put that thought interruption there? Can you actually think about what's objectively going on? If someone's behaving a certain way, is that really about me, or is it about them at that moment in time? You know, I think these are all valuable skills, important things we can all do with being aware of. But the ironic thing of it, I'd be interested to hear all your accounts of this, is you almost need a little bit of self-awareness to become more self-aware. But then you can become so self-aware to the point you actually end up being quite neurotic about everything. You all have made a concerted effort into, I guess, delving into this stuff with yourself. What prompted that at what point for you guys?
I'm happy to go first. I know when this moment was for me, and I know something Josh said earlier, which was diagnosed mental illness, and I've never been formally diagnosed. And looking back in retrospect, there was potentially something there, and again, trying to avoid this idea of self-labeling or self-diagnosing by all sense. And I was in a very stressful situation where suicidal ideation was the norm around me, not necessarily as me, but that was something that I was exposed to quite a lot. And it came to a point where it was, this is genuinely affecting my life to an enormous scale. I am unable to function in the world in a way that represents who I wanted to be as a person. Super angry, super reactive, and like really, really snapping at people. It started impacting work life. Very, very big when I used to be an electrician. And there was a point where it was kind of like enough is enough, something needed to change here. And it was that sort of little prompt that got me over that threshold. But something I still enormously struggle with, and I'll own up to, is the over-intellectualizing of things. Like trying to be like, oh, it's so logical, it goes from A to B to C, and it does this and it does that. When in reality, we're so messy. But that was always like my defense mechanism. Like, oh, if I can make this make sense, then it makes sense, and that works. But I think we need to be aware of that isn't always the case. And sometimes we need to be in that messiness. And that was always the bit that I struggled with. So it was like through my own therapeutic and counselling journey, and then what came out the back of that of further self-development and the work that I still do on myself now, it's trying to be in that like stickiness of it all a little bit more, as opposed to just trying to reject it through logic and make it make sense.
Yeah. Josh, if you don't mind, can I hand over to you next? Because that brings to the forefront something that sprung to mind there, is that, you know, when you intellectualize everything and you suppress it essentially, when actually that, and when I say this, is like there's a lot of internet messaging around, oh, you know, you need to feel everything, or you need to delve into that trauma. Well, truth of it is sometimes you need to do that with help. You know, delving in and dredging up your trauma all of the time is something could be quite torturous. But I think part of the societal implications of that was something which you mentioned in a message to me, Josh. Is like, how does the patriarchy and thoughts and the influence of that contribute towards this suppression of emotions and actually being quite intellectual about everything, stoically pulling up your bootstraps, stiff upper lip, sir, and cracking on?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you look at it, you know, we've got this patriarchy which was made for men, by men, and it's failing men, because at the end of the day, we wouldn't have, you know, 3/4 of the 800,000 suicides, you know, a year coming from men, if it was, you know, serving us. And that's the thing, we have these pressures and these societal norms that men have to be strong, they have to be the provider, they have to be dominant, they have to be in control, and that just puts an immense pressure to feel that seeking help is a weakness and that expressing emotions is a weakness. I know I've suffered with that. I know that I've been brought up with, and it was nothing direct. It was things like I have a number of brothers, one of them very stoic, very in control of his emotions at all times around public spaces, at funerals, wouldn't shed a tear. Same with my dad. They were always regarded as strong. I had another brother who was always crying, very emotional, very in touch with his feelings, always classed as weaker than and so that was a huge influence on me and how I had to hold myself and how I had to control my emotions, because that was my exposure to basically strong, in control. That's what we want from men. Weak, he needs to, you know, and that was, and again, nothing to fault of either of my brothers. It's just how they dealt with their emotions. And obviously, I think a lot of men resonate with that of, oh shit, I need to be in control. And I've struggled immensely. I still do with talking about my emotions, expressing my feelings. My wife will tell you, you know, it takes a lot for me to get to that point where I feel, and it's like really, really uncomfortable for me. And then I've had to go through therapy. And the problem is with that suppression, like you just mentioned, it's led to me having some catastrophic coping mechanisms, which have then had other people suffer around me, you know, whether it be gaming, drugs, porn. I mean, I've had a lot of really, really nefarious coping mechanisms and addictions because I was not addressing the things that I had going on, the trauma that I had been through, because that's just what I felt I had to do. And like I say, it's an ongoing battle. It's not, like you said, something we cure, right? It's not something that is like this end point. It's an ongoing, and of course now I just use dark humor as my coping mechanism. But yeah, it's.
Chris, before I hand over to you, thank you for sharing that, mate. Cause, you know, I know there's a huge amount of personal stuff there. We've got a question as well, but just a couple of things that brought to the forefront of my mind there is like I feel like when you mention the patriarchy, there's a load of men out there rolling their eyes. It can be used quite as a divisive term. When we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about a system of beliefs, the structural conditions around how that socially impacts us, how that culturally impacts us. It's not men versus women, which I think sometimes quite divisively can be used by certain female groups to cause division. And, you know, equally, same with men as well. But you spoke there about, you know, coping things that you got into. I think that's, you know, there's a lot of shame around that. I think if you can think about fitness, we can talk about porn, we can talk about, you know, people meticulously tracking morsels of food. Is when we're comfortable having these conversations, it's a different ballgame. But then finding the right ears to speak to that can appropriately respond is the challenge. Because I always think we talk a lot about the strength in speaking and speaking being the issue, but actually, who can you appropriately go to and listen? Who can you know, pour your heart out to when you're at your most vulnerable? Because probably I'm throwing them under the bus here. I always use this example of, I've got some long-term friends, which are amazing friends that'd be there for me in a heartbeat. But I probably wouldn't be who I'd go to when I was like really struggling with something. And that's not a slight on them. That's just me having an understanding of, you know, who I can and who I can't go to, and whether I'm setting myself up for success. With the response in that. The other thing I've lost The other thing that I was going to mention there is when we talk about stoicism, because I do, admittedly, I shit on stoicism quite a lot because I find it funny, because, you know, a lot of the Stoics were paedophiles, and, you know, it's funny how we like epitomise and we evangelise a lot of these people from our past. Obviously, second-hand accounts is, we don't know whether it is true, but there are benefits to stoicism. And when we talk about emotional regulation, I think that's very different to emotional suppression. So when you talk about how that physically manifested itself in coping mechanisms for you, that would, you know, without me speculating, that arguably be a little bit of emotional repression, whereas actually emotional regulation and how to do that for you is something I'd encourage for most people. And I think something that's really helped me with my mental health is just understanding where my window tolerance is, and understanding when I'm a little bit hyper aroused and a little bit hyper aroused, and kind of how to bring myself back into that window of tolerance. Because emotional regulation, good thing. Stoicism from a emotional suppression, because we don't really need any more emotionally stunted men, probably not so helpful thing. Sorry, interjection. And after your bit, Chris, remind me to ask this question that someone's been waiting for to answer.
Yeah, for me, it was a case of very similar actually, very similar story, and it's, you know, it's not a surprise to hear similar stories across the board, because I think it's something that almost universally a lot of men do struggle with. And it was never modelled to me how to express or regulate these emotions, and as a result, I did end up suppressing so much, and undoubtedly that then contributed towards mental health challenges, as I was referring to earlier. And I was in a place where, you know, as I say, I felt depression was the main thing I felt. Suicidal ideations were a constant as well. The biggest challenge, though, for me was the fact that I was super functional, and I was able to hide it so well. So I was able to continue working. I could hang out with friends and family, and nobody had any idea. No one had an inkling. And that often, you know, that's so often the case when there's been a suicide and there's so much shock around it. You know, this person, like, nobody had any idea, because on face value they were doing really well, they were happy, etc. But so yeah, that was the case for me, and that was a period of probably about 5 or 6 years. And it took a conversation with somebody. It took one conversation to really kind of spark that journey, if you want to use that sort of terminology. Up to that point, I had felt very alone. Like, I felt like I was the only person who was struggling with this, and social media certainly didn't help, where it's pretty much a highlights reel, and you think about stages of life and people are sort of settling down or getting houses and got lots of money and that sort of thing. And for me, it just wasn't happening. In fact, that was the opposite end of the scale. And that just really compounded how I was feeling, until I eventually had a conversation with someone who had very, very similar experiences to the ones that I had had. And actually just him being able to relate to him just opened me up massively. I was able to ask loads of questions and explain. And when he was talking about some of his experience, I was like, I get what that's like. I know that feeling myself. And from that point, it gave me a little bit of hope to realize like, okay, I can actually improve things, because I was at a point where I didn't think that was possible. And then it was just a bit of an ongoing journey, kind of. I did get professional help, went through therapy, and there was one story that sticks with me forever. Like, I thought I was doing quite well, making good progress, and when we were talking about suppressing emotions, there was one exercise that the therapist took me through, and I went in quite positive, feeling like like I say, making progress. And this exercise, just I can't explain it, but this sort of wave of emotion came from deep within me, and I could not stop it from coming up. And I got very upset and that sort of stuff. And at the end of the exercise, I was like, what the fuck was that? And my therapist was like, that is you just releasing all of those pent up emotions that you've pushed down and pushed down and pushed down, and you're going to have to continue to do that to move to a better place. So it took a long time, but that was, that initial conversation kind of started that journey. And that's a bit of a snapshot.
Sharing that, mate. I think that's such a valuable point that I think you've all brought up exactly the same issue. Is like, it was significant, firstly, that you went and spoke to someone about it. I think we know that, but finding the right ears to speak to. And there was one other point I was going to mention. I've lost my train of thought. Let me ask this question, which you can all ponder. and then I'm sure it will come back to me. At which point during the depressive phase, building an emotional wall is no longer an option and you should seek therapy? But for me, at least, I'll get the ball rolling. But I think the fact that you're asking that question is probably a good prompt. That's probably enough to give you the impetus to go out and seek help. And I'd certainly suggest perhaps speaking to your GP to begin with. So if there's got curiosity around your resilience wavering a little, you might be just that you need a little bit of extra help, or you need some direction at the moment, is what I would say. Guys?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it.
At which point during the depressive phase, building an emotional wall is no longer an option and you should seek therapy?
For me personally, I think it's being aware that actually therapy can be a proactive approach as well, as opposed to just a reactive. So if you feel as though, like, oh, exactly like you said, Dan, like this could be a place where I maybe need to seek assistance. What are the downsides of you actually seeking assistance? And then if it turns out that that wasn't as required, you've still got the benefits from the therapy. You've still got the benefits from having the tools if anything comes up in the future. I think we're so quick to see as this like reactive approach that we only take when we're absolutely in the worst places. And obviously that's something that I'm sure, I think across the board, we all agreed with. That was when we actually turned to therapy. But just being aware that you can do it prior to any of this happening. And if anything, that can be a really great defense mechanism to anything getting worse in the future. So is there if we weighed up sort of like risk versus reward of what's the risk of going to therapy now, is there actually any downsides to you taking that proactive approach? Then maybe that might be the best option, whether you feel that it's 100% required or not.
Yeah, I agree, because I wish I had gone before my destructive behaviors hurt others, right? So, and that's the other thing. It's like I was fine hurting myself because I was dealing with it, but then when it was hurting others, and obviously I left it too little too late, and it was a case of then having to go through that whole process to try to work through all of that. And so I think, taking that proactive approach, yeah, is really important. I guess you could even analogize it with fitness or fat loss or anything like that, with regards to like be proactive, getting a coach, being healthy, rather than waiting until you're lifted out of your house by a crane. Probably is going to be a good place to start,
Yeah, it's like going for walks in daylight and eating healthily only gets you so far, but it's worth giving that time some effort before you go elsewhere. So across the board, I think there's like many similarities, but something which I just kind of wanted to address was that, and this is probably like on Insta therapy sound bites, is we see instances of people talking about being healed or this fully actualized version of themselves, just like floating above the ground, like the complete product. And what you've all said, and what I kind of will echo as well, is it's ongoing. Like the reps are undeniable. I think when we talk about maintaining your health, your well-being, when we talk about your mental health involved with that, is you still got to do it. Like, you still got to do the work. That's going to be very individual for certain people. Certain people, it's just going to be maintaining those, I guess, support pillars, whether it's making sure you're getting a social connection, whether it's making sure you're, moving your body, getting out in daylight, getting out in nature, taking the dog for a walk, whatever that may be. But you need to continue to do that stuff. It's exactly the same with our health. There's never an end point. And I think when you can add layers of value to that don't revolve around it being a definitive end, because a lot of the things that we focus on, especially when it comes to goal setting, is always towards a definitive outcome. This stuff, there isn't an end to this, so you've got to find justifiable reasons for wanting and continuing to do that, even when you don't want to. We talk about loving the process also in fitness a lot. Well, you don't need to love the process. We all do lots of things we don't love a lot of the time, but you need to see value in it. And seeing the value in it, recognising it sort of benefits you, even when you really don't want to do it, is an incredibly powerful tool, I think, to apply.
What's your, I'm going to throw a conversation starter in here, views on...
What's my mental illness? I'm not... No.
So there is a take that mental illness, or mental health anyway, is quite a privileged problem, right? So what I mean by that is... the person who's in a depressive state and they're like, I need to take a couple of days off work, I need to be able to, deal with all these things. obviously comes from quite a privileged position, whereas the mother, who's a single parent in a very low socioeconomic status, she hasn't got time. She hasn't got the availability of resources, the either that's financially, time, education wise, to be able to deal with those things, right? Because you just don't. And so that was coming from a friend who was, coming from a very poor background. I remember them saying that to me. It was just quite interesting, because that was actually a time when I was starting some therapy, and I said, therapy's a rich person problem, because and again, they just spoke about that whole kind of concept, and that was an interesting take, and I just wanted to throw that in there and see what everyone's thought on that was.
Yeah, I mean, like most things, I think there's a bit of nuance in there. I'd agree strongly to begin with, because certain privileged societies, and depending demographically where you live and stuff, and access. I also think a culture in that. So all my family are Turkish Cypriot, so like mental illness is just not a thing.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean its existence isn't there. It's just not recognised. So I suppose that would be my main point, is just that because someone isn't aware or someone doesn't have the means to kind of address it, doesn't mean it's not present.
Of course. Yeah. I think that again.
Certainly that does come with a certain amount of privilege, especially like if you're going to private paid therapy yourself, which not everyone has access to. A lot of people are on 3 to 6 month waiting lists at the moment to speak to someone. We like to say, eat healthily, but if it's a economic state of the country at the moment, especially in the UK, and you've got single mother, as you said, she needs to put £10 on her electricity meter or feed her family. Well, she's not going to go buy a punnet of blueberries for a fiver. She's get ready meals, and there's no judgment on her, because she's just thinking about full belly. She's not thinking about the nutritional value of those meals. So again, it's easy to make judgments about other people, but there is a certain amount of privilege involved, I think.
Yes, I think it's something which I don't think a lot of people talk about, or not I've seen anyway. I don't know. I just think it's something which
I agree.
And even in fitness, I mean, again, we're going off of tangent here, but even in fitness, we see that where we'll get the coaches who'll be like, "Oh, look, this meal only costs £5," and you're like, "Yeah, but that £5 could have gone on a family-sized pizza to feed." And we're not talking about this, which is a huge impact on obesity and driving obesity, because we see the poorer populations have more fast food chains within those areas, and again, calorie per value for the amount they're paying. I think it's just such a complicated and nuanced topic, and like you say, there's so many moving parts to it, with who it applies to and how to address that. And this is why it's always an interesting one, because I'm always trying to it's like because when we talk, like, that's why this is why I started the whole conversation off just with that initial point, just because I think it's important to talk about these kind of things, because not a lot of people do, and it can be really easy for us to be like, let's go to therapy, or and it's like, well, that's potentially not an option, for some people, and so it can be tough.
Well, I know we had a chat about this a different time, Stu, but I think luck, privilege, serendipitous circumstances, and survivorship bias are things we don't really address often, but they're all huge parts of it. Sometimes it is just plain luck, but when we speak about physical health, and exactly as you said, socio-economically deprived areas are hotspots for fast food places, because it is accessible, but also within those places they don't always have access to outdoor space to play ball games. They certainly don't have access to things like community centres with gyms, or that put on local football games and things like that. So
I think that's something that I know people. Something that people took, like that idea of luck. When there's this huge narrative that says like, "Oh, I'm not lucky. I worked hard," and I think as soon as we say those kind of words, like, we're denying that we have privilege over someone else in the world. Like, there's someone out there that they didn't choose to be where they are. They didn't choose the circumstances that they find themselves in. And whilst there is this aspect of like personal responsibility, the environment that the people need to make those choices in, they didn't choose. And when you were saying there, Dan, about outdoor spaces and playing football, like some people are genuinely scared to leave their houses at night because and we've got people saying, oh well, it's dead easy to get 10,000
Yeah,
steps.
just go out for a walk.
Yeah, just go out.
I mean,
You might get shanked, but fuck
yeah,
it, it's fine.
Sorry, if you don't mind me interjecting, the point I just want to kind of raise there, because it's something I'm speaking to a lot of women about, especially at the moment, is like almost the male privilege side of that, in that I've never worried about going for a walk at night and keeping my keys in my hand or walking across a car park. Is, you know, I think a lot of men in fitness are still going, oh, you know, go out of an evening, ladies, go for a walk down the road. You know, let alone that there's still a huge amount of, not that I'm making trivial that like how much femicide and how many attacks on women there are, but I think there does come, when we talk about health measures and things that we could implement, there is a bit of privilege that comes from that, from a male perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also a counter narrative to that as well. Like I was in Glasgow at the weekend, staying on Argyle Street, which was wild to say the least. Everyone absolutely smashed, and we're no means denying anyone else's struggles, but I think this idea that all men feel safe when they walk outside also isn't helpful. Like, there was groups of 20 lads and I was on my own.
Yeah.
And we know that domestic attacks outside happen a lot to men as well. And I think it's understanding that this isn't us versus them. It's we need to come up with solutions that work together and work across the board and can apply across the board. And, you know, we were saying right at the start about this idea that not being strong on the surface is frowned upon within our society. So even just admitting that actually, like, I was nervous to walk past all of these people. People don't want to acknowledge that. And, like, I'm okay with owning that because that was genuinely how I felt.
Yeah.
But it's not a us versus them, but there's also that other side of the coin as well, that we've got some people out there saying, yeah, absolutely, like, just go outside and walk. And it's not just potentially women that are scared to do that, but also some men as well. And I think it's just acknowledging that can apply across the board.
Yeah.
I think just going back to what the point was initially about the sort of feeling privileged and that sort of thing. I 100% totally agree with it, and I suppose it extends into this conversation now as well. Is you were talking about developing and sort of cultivating self-compassion within ourselves, and obviously society as a whole would just be so much better if we could all be that little bit more compassionate towards each other. So when you're talking about being in Argyle Street, and by the way, totally relatable, I 100% know what you're all about. Yeah, if we could see from a perspective, if we could see everybody else and how they're feeling in that situation, or even imagine how they might be feeling in that situation, then we might be that little bit less quick to judge. And yeah, obviously that's going to create a much more level playing field as well when we think about society as a whole.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, Stu, when you were telling that, I was listening to every word you said, and I think I did have a moderate smirk on my face at some point. Because, I mean, I'm normally, like, my rational brain is telling me just to breeze by this, carry on the conversation, but I think it's quite apt. I'm not even going to say the person's name. Their comment is, and can you all see this?
Yeah, I see that.
This is so gay, and I can't help but say, case in point, exactly. Like, for you to come on to this live chat and say that. So what exactly do you mean by that this is so gay? Because I think that's, firstly, what's wrong with being gay? What if I am gay? What's the problem with being gay? Secondly,
what, someone said what?
Well, I can't see the comments either, Josh, so, like, I can't see these.
All
I
right.
can just
So
see
when
loads
they
of people
say
joining.
this is so gay.
Because I didn't see any penises in any bum holes around it. I don't know. This is a very strange concept.
It's not that sort of live, but there's no issue with being gay, even if we were gay. So what's the problem there? But also, I think, as use of a derogatory term, because I don't consider it a derogatory term. Whatever, what everyone does is up to them. I've got many gay friends, but if that is being used in the case of as a derogatory term, as we know it is, and bants amongst men, that's exactly the sort of thing that shuts down these conversations.
Now this is it's interesting. It's interesting. I just made that point about trying to be sort of compassionate. It's really difficult in this instance where something like that happens. Like, my instinctive response is like, oh, come on, getting a bit pissed off about that. But actually, when I try and take that step back and go, right, okay, let's try and come at it from that compassionate point of view. Like, what's actually going on for you? Like, there's some clear issues and challenges that you must have in order for you to make that sort of comment in the first place. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Sorry, I just wanted to interject just because on my recent post, so I did a suicidal post just raising awareness around male suicide, and I actually had a comment. I had a comment from a guy who said, "This is all fucking bullshit. No one gives a fuck about men's feelings. Just man the fuck up. Get on with it, right?" And you know what my initial, I actually wrote a comment out. I was like verbally assaulting him, kind of like, "You're a fucking idiot." Da, 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 da. And then obviously, just as you just did there, took a second and then realized it was like, this guy has obviously gone through something where he has shown some weakness. He has shown something of this nature and it's been shut down. And so that's where he's coming from, because he's been hurt in the past, right? Or he's had some kind of experience which has then formed that. And so then I approached it with compassion. I was like, that was it. He says, why start speaking about it now? Kind of thing. I was like, well, 600,000 men globally killing themselves a year is probably a good reason to start. I can fuck all this macho bullshit that you're bringing on. If you need someone to speak to, my DMs are always open. Have a chat, and obviously they respond to that. But it's interesting to those people who are usually the most controversial or speaking in those kind of direct derogatory terms are usually the ones that are most insecure, the ones that are the most have the most baggage coming from certain experiences and things. Kill them with compassion and make them realize there is a different route to take with it.
I mean that's almost why I was grinning, because I don't feel animosity towards this person, because as you say, it's obviously coming from a place of, I don't know, ignorance or pain, perhaps from their own point of view. But I do think it was important to address, because that is the sort of thing, if we weren't as comfortable as we all are talking about these things openly, it's no slight on me. Like I couldn't give a monkeys that this person has said that, but I know this would shut the conversation down for a lot of people. And when we are encouraging people to speak out and seek out the right ears to speak to, is that if you wear your heart on your sleeve, like doesn't matter how many people are watching, we're putting this out. This is going out to whoever. If you wear your heart on your sleeve and you're shut down, you're naturally going to withdraw. That's not going to help anyone towards the future. So even if that's your genuine thoughts, perhaps don't verbalise that or vocalise it all the time. But yeah, where do those beliefs about that come from? I think you can be, who decides what masculinity is? And hopefully we're at a space now and a time where, why are we still using that as a derogatory term? I know, like, why people flippantly say it. Maybe they even said it as a joke, but if you're a very sensitive person, or perhaps you're a gay person, that would just shut the conversation down. So, yeah, it's just important to talk about it, I think.
I think this links back to what we talked about at the start, though. Like, things make sense in context. So, like, behaviours make sense in context. So as long as we assume that people have the best intentions at heart, they're just making decisions that are based on their short-term needs, that are, whatever that is, relief from the discomfort that they're potentially experiencing because we're talking so openly about these things, then that now makes sense. Like, yeah, maybe that doesn't have your long-term intentions at heart, or something that's, this idea of being open and vulnerability, maybe that's not the case and they've just reacted in the same way. But like we say, it would make sense in context, and if we continue to take that role, then
I think like the conversation around insecurity and our own insecurities, I have had many over the years, is a good conversation as any to have, perhaps as a separate chat, because something I find is in like the manosphere, if you like, some of maybe the red pill intel gang, is a lot of that revolves around the proverbial flex, whether it's financially, it's like, if from a heteronormative sense, like how many birds I've slept with, like how much money I make, look at the car I drive, look at the watch I wear. And the question from that tribe, I feel, is also, oh, why has everyone else got an issue with this? And it's not necessarily, I don't have an issue with that, but I can, same reason why I go to a new gym and you'll notice other guys peacocking around you, like, because they're bigger than you and things like that. You're like, well, that comes from a place of insecurity. I think the bigger question is why do you feel the need to project those things? If I know Instagram is what it is and it's a showreel and whatnot, but I think confidence is quiet. if you're confident, secure, and happy with something, fine, share that occasionally. But if you feel compelled to flash that stuff and flex that stuff all of the time, the more interesting question is, why do you feel the need to do that?
You brought up something which I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. I don't know why it's come up into my head now, but when I was, I originally started my fitness journey as an amateur boxer. When I was an amateur boxer, I felt I was probably the most insecure. I was literally walking down the street, eyeing up every guy, like, how am I going to fight them? What would I do? You know, how I could beat them and everything. And then when I started building some muscle and actually got into bodybuilding, I actually became more secure in my body and I actually became more confident. And I then, like you say, express that silent confidence. And I've seen certain individuals who have gone the inverse, where they've gone from bodybuilding, they said that's creating an insecurity. Then they've gone into BJJ, and now in all their content, they're saying, I could choke you out. I could do. You know, using that as their kind
of. Can you
not
like, share my content on a live, please?
Sorry. No, because isn't rolling around with other men on the floor, while sweaty and that's very.
You're not a real man unless you're making eye contact with it.
Yeah, heavy breathing.
Yeah. No. I get you. I think again, it's like a flex in a different sense. It's about what I can achieve, what I can do, and how I'm some superiority of some sorts. So I used to be, I've got bigger muscles than you, but actually, do you know what? Now I can still beat you up.
Yeah.
Like,
it's just exactly. It's just different projections of the same.
I mean, I would hazard a guess they are one of the less experienced ones, because what I found of martial arts is actually not just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've done Muay Thai, I've done karate, I've done kickboxing over the years. Is that quiet confidence as well? And sometimes the most capable and deadly people, they're the sweetest people. They've got no ego about them at all, because they're confident in their own abilities. They've got, and they're also the ones that, if you have been out, not that it happens recently because I'm a social hermit, but if I think back, like in my early 20s, when you go out even socially with those groups, they're always the ones that want to diffuse a situation. Like they're like, and I'm thinking about other guys who are lethal and more than capable of not diffusing that and actually escalating if they want to. But it's that quiet confidence. They want to de-escalate everything. They're just out to have a good time. And I always think that when we talk about like alphas and how to be overtly masculine all of the time, it's who decides that? I know some very sweet, empathetic, compassionate, jacked, lethal guys, but they don't go around flexing about that. They just.
I think that's where, again, like the definitions of masculinity, right? Because of course the origins of masculinity are exactly those traits. It's strong, it's providing, it's things that were actually applicable to real world scenarios when we had to utilize those masculine traits. Like now in the modern world, in the Western society, we don't need those. We don't need to be the biggest, the strongest, the most jacked to prevail, if anything. And so this is where that kind of modern masculinity comes in, and that's where the whole definition around masculinity is now just malleable, and what even is masculinity, So it's an interesting conversation. I was actually asking my wife yesterday, I was like, what is a masculine man to you? And she came from a dad who was very caring, more caring than her mother was. And so she doesn't attribute those types of traits with masculine. It's rather just, again, this is a whole debate of itself, but he has a penis. That's what a man is and everything like that. And again,
we're not going to
get into that topic. I'm not going into
that. We've done so well.
But again, that's, I was just expressing, her views on it, and everybody has a different view on what masculine is, whether it's traits, whether it's their approach to life, and I think it's a hard terminology to try to pin down now. I don't know. What would be your definitions of masculinity?
Yeah, for me, in the work that I do, my sort of focus is to work on redefining the strongman. So as you say, what it actually means to be strong. For me, it's someone who is able to have those difficult conversations, but they know clearly what their boundaries are as well. So they have drive, they have direction, they have a vision going forward as well. But it's not there's less emphasis on obviously those physical traits, which is so often the other way around. It's so much typically in society about how you look and how strong you are physically. But I think, as Dan was reflecting on about those people who are kind of more reserved and kind of stay out of it, but have the skills and abilities to diffuse situations, like those are the really strong individuals. And those, for me, that is absolutely the definition of masculinity, for me personally, anyway.
I think for me, it's so dynamic. Like, you know, we were saying earlier on about how it's a continual journey towards work. And that's because life's dynamic, like life changes. Like anything could come in at any point and completely throw you off what you thought was, you know, you could be working really, really hard on your self-development, on your growth, on doing all of these things. And there can be a curveball that comes in from left field, knocks you completely off your feet and leaves you feeling battered and bruised on the floor. And I think it's understanding that because life is so dynamic, because so much can change, because there is so much uncertainty, that we should try and resist seeking that false certainty of being like, this is what this thing is, let's put it in a box. And I think that leans into that nuance of like, I don't think I could pick something and say it is definitely X, Y, Z, because how that shows up for different people is going to be so different based on their own unique perspectives. You know, exactly like Joshua said there, his wife's perspective is based on her unique lived experience around the people that she's had, and no one else has lived her life, so she's entirely entitled to that particular idea. But to cover that broadly is like to like cover it with the brush would be really difficult for sure for me.
Exactly, it's the whole notion of spectrums, right? It's like situational. Same with food, same with exercise, same with anything. It's always this kind of like, it is not this dichotomous masculine, feminine. You know, it's all down to, you know, each individual, their personal circumstances, their personal relationship with their own, whatever you want to call masculinity, femininity, whatever. You know, in the dynamics of their life, in the dynamics of their relationship. And I think a lot of people just like, and it just comes back to everything we were talking about earlier, right, with labels. You know, everybody likes to just put labels on things, and you know,
I think
there's actually a quote just to follow on from what Josh said there from the book Full Spectrum Thinking. A guy called Bob Johansson. It's like a business book. Would not recommend it. It was an awful read, or it's quite difficult for me to read. But there is one bit that says like full spectrum thinking is the ability to seek patterns and clarity across gradients of possibility, outside, across, beyond, or maybe even without any boxes or categories, whilst resisting false certainty. So that's where I took that bit from. But I just think that fit beautifully with what you said. Hence why I was just looking at my laptop there.
As you say, because life's in a constant state of flux. That's circumstantial, and again that air of caution, if you tie yourself to a very strict, rigid definition you subscribe to, is when that's challenged, possibly, which is life has a habit of throwing shit our way, to a curveball. Like, would you do? And like, I don't mind sharing. Has anyone got to get off, by the way?
No,
I'm good.
Yeah, in 2 minutes. Yeah,
that's fine. I was just going to say, if anyone's got any questions that's watching at the moment, just throw them in the box and we'll get round to them. But I've never been like an archetypical kind of masculine. I'll just define myself as an geezer. Like I've been quite that way my whole life most of the time. And a few years ago, 2 years ago, when my son was born. So my son was one of two. He had a sister, and she was sadly stillborn. And although I've never had this strict, definitive version of what a man is in my mind, I did feel like that was almost a threat to my masculinity. And this is like the intellectualizing and recognizing the emotional side of things. So despite knowing rationally, there's absolutely nothing I could have done about that. For me, in my mind at that time, it really threatened my identity because, well, men are supposed to be protectors, men are supposed to be providers. But as a protector, I failed at my very basic, most foundational thing that I should have been able to do. And again, I can intellectualize myself out of that. I can rationally talk myself out of that, but that doesn't remove from how that felt to me and how long, and probably still a little bit, there's probably still echoes of that I'm dealing with. And that's, you know, the work we're talking about constantly doing is interesting because we have these conversations from a point of awareness and privilege now, but we've been subjected to so much programming through our developmental years. Like, you think about when boys are told they're boys, and that even subconsciously, I look at my daughter and my son, is we bring them up the same in my opinion, but he still laughs at farts, and he's still mischievous, and he still does boy shit, and she's quite creative, quiet, and I don't know whether that's a social influence, our influence, but I imagine it's all of it, and we're all subjected to that programming. So it's only when we get to that point of taking a concerted look at these things is that actually we can question where those beliefs came from.
Yeah. I mean, I was massively influenced, like Action Man, He-Man. Yeah. Again, that's obviously shaped my idea of like how a man should look and be, and all those kind of things, right? And yeah, it's complex. It's a complex issue because is it that it's that chicken and egg scenario? Is it that males gravitate towards those things, or is it because the societal pressures have put those thinking into those? And obviously that's a very complex and question that I don't think we have answers to. So yeah.
No, but I mean that's I think the valuable thing about these conversations is, do you know what, we have this desire to know everything. Sometimes there's just not one bloody definitive answer. But actually talking about this stuff helps us all make sense of it a little bit more. So Josh, I know you've got to shoot, mate. Thank you so much for your time. Yes. In fact, all of you, we haven't had any other questions. Let's wrap it up there, and we'll get another one in at some point. But thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you, your contributions, everything you've shared, and thank you everyone that's watched. If you have enjoyed it, share it with someone else. It might be valuable to someone else, and I'll collaborate this with all you guys so other people can see it as well. But yeah, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dan, for creating the space for us to have these conversations.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking part. Take care.
Thank you,
Cheers, thank you. Take care.
See you later.